Shel, you've been instrumental in the evolvement of housing legislation. What do you consider as some of the high points or achievements of your career?
Well, as we were saying before a little bit, um, until this interview, I never really thought about it because I think most of the things that I did or was involved in were very small programmatic changes that, people in the industry would recognize, but they were hardly earth shaking. And I was lucky enough, maybe this is what I was lucky enough to serve both at HUD with Larry Simons and then moving over to the House Banking Committee under Tom Ashley. And that was a wonderful time because we had a Democratic administration, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate. And even in the House, which was a very different place, we cooperated. Gary Brown of Michigan was the Republican ranking member, and our staffs worked well together. He and Lud Ashley worked well together. And it was certainly those 2 years were the best jobs I had and probably the most satisfying for that reason. Now, in terms of specific accomplishments then, I would say that what was interesting then is this was 1977, 78. And it's the first time we started really worrying about the budget in housing programs. And when we had a Section 8 program, I still remember OMB saying to us, well, you can't just take 1 year of Section 8 funding, you've got to take 40, because our contracts were 40 years long then. I think near the end of my time there, again, I don't take credit for it, I think we cut the Section 8 term to 20, and renew forever so we could cut the budget numbers. But was a real concern then for the first time that I remember about the HUD budget. I could tell you maybe one little story that when I was trying to think, did I have anything to do with anything? Some point when I was still with Larry, OMB was concerned about the Section 8 program and wanted to convert, I can't remember the details, but they certainly wanted to convert much to vouchers, to existing housing. And I'll give Larry the credit. Pat Harris was there, but I honestly don't remember any rule for if we're just doing very little rehab or not doing any rehab, why do we have to attach it to a contract, to a Section 8 contract? And the answer, of course, is it let people build because they had a stream of income. But we were really afraid of getting eliminated. We sat around one night in his office and started talking about, well, let's have something less than a full rehab program that'll be a little bit cheaper. And I think one of the names we threw around was less than moderate rehab, which doesn't have much to it. But we sat there and came up with a moderate rehab. Now, moderate rehab probably saved a lot of the Section 8 funding at that point in time. It wasn't a big deal, but it's become an important program. So I think what we had then was we had an administration, obviously, that was committed, fighting with its own OMB, to keeping as much alive as it could. Maybe that's enough for the other things we did when I went to the Hill, and I don't get credit for it, maybe a little draft, UDAG, Urban Development Action Grants. That was an initiative really started out of HUD by Bob Embry. We passed it. Then in private practice, I worked on the first one. But we also, God, I'm going to run out of things to be free to respond to your questions if I keep going. We also created something called the Flexible Subsidy Program, which, 7 of us still remember, maybe it still exists, which is to give troubled HUD projects subsidy needed beyond the Section 8 or beyond the 236, whichever it was. And I remember I learned something then, that we were working on it, and we had the first draft that we circulated to people in the industry. We certainly weren't shy about sharing things, was to make the flexible subsidy program, which was additional funding for subsidized projects that were in trouble. We wanted to make it a grant program. And I thought, why would anybody object to a grant program? And a major HUD owner, whose name I won't mention because they're probably still investigating him, although he did die, said, "Why the hell are you making it a grant? Make it a loan. If it's a grant, I have to report it as income." And we ended up changing it. These are little things, from a grant program for private owners to a grant program for nonprofit owners. So those are little tinkering things that we were able to talk about with the industry that I suspect, we learned a lot from. We made the whole relationship with the industry was friendly and cooperative, and nobody on the Hill, Republicans especially, we were partners, and it was a real joy. So maybe that's enough for now.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Hubert Humphrey. I've been a fan of his from my years of living in Minnesota. So do you
Oh, I
have
didn't even know that.
oh yes. Do you have a story about him that you could share?
Well, I was hardly a key aide. Let me tell you how it happened. Then I would say this. This is a funny story. It's probably not even true, but I've said it so often that I'm starting to believe it. I was at the University of Minnesota, and I did grow up in Minnesota, even though my son says I look like every Jewish guy from New Jersey. I'm a pure Midwesterner. And I had a professor at Minnesota that I said, "I'd like to go to Washington some summer." And he said he knew somebody at Humphrey staff, blah, blah, blah. And I ended up being a summer intern. And the second summer was the summer he got nominated for vice president by Johnson. And we had a secret mission going on in the office of interns and a few staff by trying to solicit delegates and build support for it. But anyhow, jumping way ahead, I was never we can say I was a staff member, but I was very peripheral. I was detailed to him after he became vice president when I was on the HUD payroll. But one time on the 68 campaign, and I got to travel with him, and I went out and said, America's students are for Humphrey. I was a co-chairman of Harvard students for Humphrey, and then there was another guy with me. And we started talking just probably a minute on the plane. And he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, when I go back into the campaign, I'm going to finish law school." He said, "Honest to God, I think this is the truth." He said, "Well, good. Maybe I'll put you on the Supreme Court. It'll look good on your resume." Probably would have looked good on my resume. All right, and that I think is a true story.
Whereabouts in Minnesota did you live?
But we're in the news these days. I grew up in North Minneapolis.
Okay. I started with Minneapolis Housing Authority in 1963.
You're not old enough.
Oh, yes, I am. Oh, yes, I am. And that was not my first job.
I was a classic urban, Jewish immigrant experience. All my grandparents were born overseas. Both my parents were born in North Minneapolis. The neighborhood changed. The Jewish people moved, in that case, northwest. But I did go to the same, not the elementary school, because we were probably 2 miles north, but the same junior high and the same high school as my parents. And it was a terrific public school. It still exists. It's almost all minority now. And it seems to get a footnote when they talk about the problems of North Minneapolis. It was probably a more targeted area, but since the George Floyd thing, South Minneapolis, which was then a smaller community, it's gotten more attention. But it was a very progressive place. And it's funny that I still, my parents, everybody worshipped Hubert Humphrey. And it was because he got credit for opening up Minneapolis in terms of the discrimination laws. I remember sometime in my childhood, the city elected its first Jewish alderman. That was a very big deal. Now, of course, it's got a Jewish mayor, a Jewish congressman in the suburbs. It was a very different place then.
Well, let's go back to public policy. What are some of your thoughts on the last 50 years of public policy in this area? You touched on it, but what do you think in comparison to what should we have learned from what went on back then, and how would you contrast that with public policy today?
Hmm. Well, I remember what I learned, and I think Larry used this Simons again, who I worked for a year. We started debating the tax code. This is, and he said, we've got to have many, many arrows in our quiver. And it's not just tax advantages, and there were some small tax advantages in the laws, even back in late 70s, early 80s. But we have to have those kind of tools behind, in addition to the spending. Spending is a big target. Tax things are more hidden, at least they're more hidden then. And just the emphasis on the tax system rather than pure spending, I think, was a big help. I'll still remember, it's not a very profound statement, but it's another story. I was lucky enough, I was afterwards, I was active in the industry looking for clients, I suppose, more than public policy. But I was counsel to a thing called the National Housing Rehab Association, which is started around then and is still very much alive, very thriving, focusing more on the tax credit in terms of a subsidy. But I remember we had a speech with Barney right after, I don't know what year it was ever the Republicans took control of the House. And somebody, maybe me, but again, I don't want to ask Barney Frank what he thought was going to happen to the low-income housing tax credit with a Republican congressman. He said, I think it's fine. Republicans can't stand poor people or housing, but they love tax credits. And there was, I'm joking about it, but there was something fairly profound in that. That has probably enabled that program, which is, it hasn't really replaced HUD, but it certainly supplemented HUD to survive. It's sort of a hidden subsidy. Did I learn anything? As a Washingtonian, I was very suspicious of the low-income housing tax credit. We can't let this stuff go to the states. We in the federal government know more. Well, maybe then, 40, 45 years ago, the federal government was a more thoughtful, more progressive place. Now I'm just grateful that we shifted a lot of this to the states, and lesser extent the cities, because they're doing innovative things. They're doing things that at the federal level we're obviously doing. I think it's fair to say we're doing nothing. We may enhance the tax credit in the new infrastructure bill. There is some provision for the tax credit. I don't know all the details anymore, but to allow income averaging and the low income credit as a permanent feature. I think lowering the requirements, the bond, and I never get this right. Thank God we had associates. From 50% to 25% in terms of the source of funding for low-income projects. But we're doing that with, frankly, it's all coming from the Democrats. You get I want to say get a few Republicans, and I'm sure if you give me some more time, no, I'm not being funny. Susan Collins was a friend. I think what I learned is that we need all these tools, and loosening up stuff and really passing the tax credit on to the states, I think turned out to be a good thing. That really surprised me.
And the longevity of it is what is sustaining us, really, because there hasn't been any new construction since basically about 1980, certainly not in public housing, not in Section 8. So without tax credit, what would we have?
We wouldn't even have public housing restructuring, because that depends on this public-private partnership. No, we'd have nothing, and I certainly haven't. God, I'm glad nobody's really listening. I mean, I'm glad no one's really listening to this. I mean, we're not nationwide live on CNN or anything, but I remember someone asked me about. A lot of people say, what do you think of HUD now and the secretary and the president, what's going on? I said, I'm really fairly pleased. We don't hear about HUD. And that's probably the best news we have. And that's a terrible thing to say, but it's It doesn't have the scandals. It's no one's trying to shut it down. We're not firing anybody at HUD. It's not like the more prominent departments. And HUD is just being left alone. And I'm sure, this career staff and probably some political appointees are doing their best with no additional resources.
When you look back on your career, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you have faced?
Probably changing jobs very often. But no, I'm not sure I've really faced. I can't. That's an honest answer. My ex-wife, my only wife, said that in the first 9 years of our marriage, I had 9 different jobs, and that's true. They're all kind of the same, but they're government, Hill. I was actually at HUD briefly, as I said, detailed to the vice president's office when he was vice president in charge of domestic policy. But eventually, aside from figuring out what I wanted to do, I can't really identify a challenge. Maybe that's a naive statement, but I just feel very, very lucky that I stumbled onto, well, I was in graduate, maybe we are the same age. I left Minnesota in '64 when I got my degree from the university. You were already working, so you could be older, I guess. Well, you could be, I don't know. You don't look it.
I'm 77.
So am I. So am
Yeah.
I.
So see, we're the same age.
You're not from Minnesota, are you?
I lived there for 20 years and all of my housing authority work was in Minnesota.
Okay. I forgot how I got sidetracked with that silliness. That's happening more and more since I turned 77.
I totally understand. But we were talking about the challenges, and you were talking about how you really haven't had any big challenges that you've had to face.
No, I think I'm very, very lucky. I started to say, I graduated there. I was lucky enough to be admitted to Princeton's Graduate School of Public Affairs. I couldn't decide between I wanted to get a PhD in politics or economics, and they offered a joint program. Then I finished there, and I said, now what the hell do I do? But that was 64 to 66. And that was the war on poverty. HUD was put together in 65, and I got hooked on it. It was fun stuff. There were smart people. I went to New York, which is a big deal for a kid from rural Minnesota. I'm not from rural Minnesota, I'm joking. And then it was a series of jobs that I was just very, very lucky to find a field that I've really enjoyed. And still do, although obviously it's less fun, and I'm certainly not in any kind of a central role anymore.
I think
I'm not sure who is in a central role anymore. Maybe that's the point. I guess I can't really name, other than some of the nonprofit coalitions, Low-Income Housing Coalition, that any kind of a leader or a spokesman anymore. I certainly never became one, but
Well, you might take somebody like Stockton Williams, who is
who? I'm sorry.
Stockton Williams, who's head of the National, I'm not going to say this right, Council of State Housing Finance Agencies. So he's really involved in the day-to-day, and in the financing and in that kind of thing. And I think he could be considered, when you look at the age groups, one of the leaders of the industry.
Okay, and I suppose where I'm seeing a lot of stuff is and I will get the name right, but it's the tax credit developers. And I'm a trustee of the National NHP Foundation, and I'm not looking for promotion, but our CEO and president, Dick Burns, who's been there 10 years, is very, very active in that. And and that's probably my biggest source now of information on housing programs. And they're the ones certainly pushing the inclusion of housing in the infrastructure bill. But I can't think of certainly nobody in government. The other thing that's just interesting, and I'm trying not to be biased, but I'm hopelessly biased towards the Democrat. I mean, if we had moderate Republicans, they'd be fine. The ranking Republican when I was on the banking committee was a guy named Gary Brown, and he was terrific. He was a moderate, progressive Republican. I don't think we have anybody like that anymore.
Well, going back, what do you feel is your legacy?
I got this interview. I don't know. For me. I assume I've made some contributions. I've represented a lot of nonprofits. I represented the Volunteers of America when we had maybe the first tax credit project in the country back in '84, '86. I've done work for a group called Christian Relief Services, New Communities Corporation out of Newark. And we built and preserved a lot of stuff. That's probably the good side. Nothing terribly innovative, but just those deals were fun to work on. I'm working on one small one in Texas now where we're co-venturing on a deal with a for-profit. Like so many of these in the lower tier or the less qualified nonprofits or less well-staffed nonprofit, the developers are running the operation, and that the nonprofit is the general partner, has a final authority, but the deals are being run primarily, these at the lower end, not the people I'm talking about, not Mercy or HOA, any of those, but so many of the lower ones, they're being run by developers, and that's okay as long as we keep it. And I think if I have any contribution, this is interesting, it may be keeping the deals the way they're intended to be and not letting anything just be ripped off by a developer. I got another funny story if you're up for it.
Sure.
Somewhere along the line, I had a client. Not all my clients were pure. Actually, most of them really were pretty. I liked most of my clients. And that's been a really fun thing about the industry. I've made my best friends are people that I met were once clients, but I had a client in Florida, and he was, the Justice Department went after him because, like a few developers may have done, he had identity of interest subcontractors, plumbers, carpenters, that he would do his business with. He certainly didn't look for 3 bids. Working on something like that right now, where a client is threatening to sue a manager because we know you didn't get 3 bids. We know you didn't independent. We know you're sending the business to yourself. And that's maybe something I've done well on behalf of a nonprofit. But this guy we had a meeting finally with the Justice Department attorney in Fort Myers. And we sat down with him, and I sat before him, and I said, "You really can't say that." He said, "Yes, I will." Somewhere in the interview, the Justice Department attorney said to him, "Well, exactly how many of these phony nonprofits that you dealt business with did you set up?" He said, "Well, I don't know. My secretary did it." And why did you do it? There's no other way to make any money off of these projects. I don't know where that story went now.
Let's talk about today for a minute. I'm thinking about the challenges that we face in housing and communities today. I'm thinking about COVID and the number of people who are unemployed and how eventually all of that is going to catch up with us, whether we're talking about small businesses that go under, whether we're talking about large businesses that start scaling back. That is going to trickle down to housing and community problems, in my opinion. So let's talk about that. What do you think about that? And what do you think then is the future of affordable housing, which already, we have long waiting lists for?
if there's anything good coming out of it, and it didn't come this, it's the whole focus on affordable, the fact there is a focus on affordable housing. I think one of the, I don't remember which of the campaigns the last 10, 12, 14 years, there was no mention of affordable housing in either platform. This time it's become not just a multifamily for lower income people working, but it's become a big focus. And I'm suspecting that if the Senate changes, probably even more so than if the administration changes this year, we'll start to see increased funding. I don't know how we avoid it. I also don't know how the hell we're going to do it with the deficit we're going to have. That the stimulus clearly has worked, particularly at the low end. There's an article in the New York Times last week that said spending, I think the lower 25% of people, and has actually come back almost to pre-COVID levels. And consumer spending jumped fairly dramatically. Again, I don't know when the stimulus checks started hitting. It mattered less for people who were, at the higher income levels. Most of us are surviving. My own, I'll call her my girlfriend. She would like to be called more than that. And my son, we're both professionals, and we're both laid off as part of this. One for a child development program, and the other at Uber. But they're not hurting. They're not hurting. They've got savings, fathers. But I think we get a Democratic Senate, even if we keep this president. If we keep this president, who I wish well, I think then we're going to start to see some funding for housing. But I don't have, because people are talking about it again. And frankly, the big advocates going back 50 years, and I like, how the hell do we get these programs? It was labor unions and construction firms that pushed the housing programs, and that it wasn't worrying about poor people or lower income people. It was a good bit. I mean, it was a good thing, but it's also a very good business.
Here's my last question. What are some of the things that you would say to the new generation of leaders?
Who are you? No. And I guess when I think of who they are, they're probably like second generation of clients. There a lot of them are a few heirs, that keep that flexibility, keep thinking, frankly, a little bit more creatively than I did. I was, I'm an old-fashioned liberal and believed in federal government spending, spend. That isn't right, and the fact that the way they've adopted, not just the tax credit, but the smaller scale projects, is just remarkable. I'm still awed that young people are coming into this business. Because to me, it was so much fun years ago, and I give them credit for wanting to do good. And I'm not sure I was that pure. I enjoyed it. It was a good way to make a living and make friends. But there's a purity now that is very important. So keep your hopes up and keep working at it and be flexible.
It's almost refreshing, isn't it, to see when a lot of the younger people are concerned about some very important things that are going to affect all of us in the long run.
Yeah, maybe the last thing, I'm on the board of advisors of the Humphrey School of Public Affairs in Minnesota. I didn't go there, but I had a connection to Humphrey, and I'm from Minnesota. And I think there's a graduate seminar there on housing policy or something, and I got to speak at it, and I saw enthusiasm for such tiny little things and excitement about little community action groups in Minneapolis and St. Paul that I used to say, oh shit, they can't do anything. They're with their 20, 30 units. We need to have 150 unit projects. Or I worked on a new town in town in Minneapolis where I don't know, it's hundreds of units actually, where it's heavily Somali, where Minneapolis's new congresswoman came out of. But they didn't care about the big dollars, and so they were just really focusing on small community things. And I think it was terrific. And I never got excited about that. I got to be honest.
There's someone you should watch for. Her name is Lynn Burton, and she is doing a course that's going to be taught at Hamline University for younger people, particularly multicultural, that are interested in getting into our industry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that things like that are on the
Mm-hmm.
horizon. And if we can get more people interested in our industry that care about it, then that's great.
Yeah,
So
and just as the course at the Humphrey School at Minnesota, it wouldn't have been, there was nothing like that 40, 50 years ago. It's and I know Lynn, and I didn't know that's what she was doing, but that's terrific.
and she is now a fellow. So I have podcasted her, and you will be able to hear her story as well.
Oh, and when is this going to be broadcast? ABC or CBS? I'm sorry.
Not quite that big. We're smaller than that, but hopefully a lot of people will watch it. Well, thank you so much, Shel, for all of your contributions over the years and keeping people on the straight and narrow as best you could. You know, we appreciate that. And I would say thank you for your contribution and enjoy your life.
Thank you. I do. And I look forward to getting out of the house. Bye-bye. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please join Kent and me, and please subscribe free to this channel. Share it with your friends and click on the thumbs up icon to like us.